welcome everybody. How's everybody doing today? Let me know in the chat. Should be a chat section open for y'all. You can go ahead and type in how you're doing today. I'm doing very well, thank you, Navi. Good to hear that y'all are doing very well. I've noticed that a lot of us have it set to panelists right now. See a little recipient line, it says to panelists. If you want everyone to be able to see what you're typing out, if you'd like to talk with the fellow LSAT students gathered here today, I'd encourage you to change that recipient line to all panelists and attendees. That way, it's not only myself, my colleague Katie, who can see what you are typing in, but you can all see each other's brilliant and incisive commentary today. So change that line to panelists and attendees when you get a chance. Say hello to everyone. Hopefully today it finds y'all very well. See, a couple of us have also found the Q&A section. Q&A section is another place where you can provide your insightful commentary during today's webinar. I would encourage you to save the Q&A section though for questions that you would like answered at the end of this session. So at the end of the session, after we've gone over the topic of the day, I'll go ahead and look at that Q&A and answer as many of those questions as I can. So if you have a question and you don't mind sticking around until the end to hear your question answered by me, hopefully, go ahead and throw that in the Q&A section. So we'll go ahead and dismiss the questions in there now because they weren't questions, but if you need a question, go ahead and throw it in the Q&A. So good to see everyone. I'm doing great. Thank you all for asking. What we're going to do today in this amazing webinar is talk about score plateaus. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get this started because we have a lot to go over with score plateaus. I imagine a lot of us gathered here today may be experiencing their own score plateau right now. We are about 2 months, a little less than 2 months before the well, much less than 2 months, actually, about 6 weeks away from the June LSAT. So this is the time in a lot of people's studies process when they might be experiencing score plateaus. So I want to go ahead and jump right into it and talk about score plateaus and really more importantly, how we can overcome those score plateaus. So let's jump right in it. But I do encourage you all, while we're going over this today, to keep it lively in the chat. I'll be kind of keeping an eye on that chat section, trying to answer as many questions that are timely that come into the chat section or address your comments as they come in. So again, we'll be responding in that chat section. But what we're going to be talking about today in this LSATMax webinar is score plateaus. So let's get to it. By the way, I haven't introduced myself. My name is Ross. I'm the director of LSATMax content. I'll be talking about score plateaus today with y'all. Let's start by just defining what score plateaus are in case you signed up for this webinar called like overcoming score plateaus and you weren't quite sure what a score plateau was. It is a kind of, I guess, metaphorical term. Score plateaus just means that you're scoring the same LSAT score on practice tests over and over again. And that's the term that gets used for a lot, score plateaus. And there's a lot of terms that get used in the kind of LSAT studying community that I don't love. I think they're kind of awkward or misleading, but score plateaus is one that I do like. And here's why I like score plateaus. Plateaus are, of course, like a natural geological feature, right? Sometimes mountains just kind of go flat for a little bit, and they're a natural feature of that mountain. And this is a little corny, but score plateaus are a natural part of an LSAT study process. It's extraordinarily normal to have a score plateau. And although it's a cause for concern illustrated by these very stressed out people you see on the right, the score plateau is a normal process, a normal part of the study process. It's not something you should really beat yourself up over. Like if you reached a plateau when you're scaling a mountain, you wouldn't be like, oh man, I really messed up climbing this mountain. I'm at a plateau right now. No. You would just be like, oh, I'm at the part of the mountain where it goes kind of flat. I'll keep kind of going up on my score plot or on this mountain, upwards to the peak of the mountain. That's really what you want to think of score plateaus like in your study process. It's a natural part of the study process, and it happens to everyone. And it's much like a plateau when you're climbing a mountain. Doesn't mean that you're not going to make it further up the mountain. It just means you're at the kind of flat part at the moment. But where score plateaus can get concerning for a lot of students is when you really get stuck in the same score for a long time. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, what you can do to progress past that score plateau. But it's important to remember it's normal, not a cause for concern if you just score this game, score a couple practice exams in a row. And because anyone who studies for the LSAT will let you know that people's score increases rarely progress in a linear manner. It's not the case that on the first practice exam you get a 150, and on the second one you get a 152, and on the third one you get a 154, and just 2 points by 2 points you get all the way up to the score that you want to eventually score in the real test. Unfortunately, studying for the LSAT, your scores kind of goes up and then stays the same, and then goes up, and then it goes down a little bit, and then goes up again, and then stays the same. The score increase is really not linear. It moves and fits and starts. It can stay the same for a long time, and then suddenly you can make a major score increase. You really just have to keep at it. Now, we'll talk about today when you reach a score plateau, how can we get past those times where it feels like I've been stuck in a score plateau for a while. And to do that, we'll have to first talk about what causes those score plateaus in the first place. Because I believe that there are a lot of misconceptions amongst people studying for the LSAT for why scores plateau. So before I get into kind of my theories and my observations about why scores plateau, I want to hear from you. Why do you guys think scores plateau on the LSAT? Why do you think you don't necessarily make progress in multiple practice exams? Okay, Victoria is saying studying wrong. That could certainly be a cause. Lack of review, definitely one. Burnout, as Bridget points out. Burnout, that's a tongue twister. Not reviewing efficiently from Isabella. Taisha says mentally drained. Not having a good study plan, wrong study habits. Underperformance, might be a symptom rather than a cause, but I guess it could be a cause too. Difficulty levels of PTs, maybe, although that, Eliana, difficulty levels of the PTs are supposed to at least be compensated for by the score conversion charts. More difficult PTs don't require you to answer as many questions correctly to get a given score. Stress, as Melody points out, feeling discouraged. Okay, I'm great that you've all pointed this out because we're going to address all of them today in this presentation. So we have a lot of things to address because there could be a lot of reasons why the scores plateau. What I want to start with is kind of the most common reason why I think scores plateau. And this is something some of you brought up, which is all about the study process for the LSAT itself. Scores plateau in my experience is because many people studying for the LSAT do not have the right plan to execute when they're studying for the LSAT. Now, when you're executing a study plan for the LSAT, what it requires you to do, generally for most test takers, is improve in two general parts of the LSAT. One part you have to improve on is your accuracy, right? Your first practice exam, you probably got a higher percentage of questions right, a lower percentage of questions answered correctly than you'll want to get on the actual test. So you have to get more accurate. You have to get more of these questions correct than you were getting on your first practice exam. But the other part you have to improve on is speed. You have to improve on the number of questions you're answering correctly. It might also be the case that on your first practice exam, you didn't answer as many questions as you maybe want to answer on the real test when you eventually take it. Am I describing your experiences with the first practice exams correctly? Your accuracy wasn't where you wanted it to be, and the speed wasn't where you wanted it to be. Is that the case for y'all? Is that how you experience practice exam? One, yeah, most of us do. Okay, so we're all on the same page. Good to hear that. And if you haven't taken your first practice exam yet, spoiler alert, you might be in the same boat with all of us right now. Okay, so accuracy and speed. Got to improve those two things, right? Here's the thing about studying for the LSAT, though. Improving in one can negatively impact the other early in the study process. We can improve accuracy. We can give you skills. We can give you tools. We can give you approaches that will help you answer a higher percentage of the questions correctly. But improving in accuracy can sometimes entail answering fewer questions. We give you these skills, we give you these strategies, we give you these approaches, but you're not masters with them yet. You don't know how to use those super efficiently. It's not like the first time you cooked, right? You might be like had a recipe to follow, but your knife skills weren't super good. You didn't know where everything in the kitchen was. You didn't know how to like mince garlic or like have more than one thing going on the stove at once. So it took a long time, right? Maybe you were able to execute the recipe and it tasted great, but you're a little slow because you weren't used to cooking at the time. So improving in accuracy is kind of like that. You get the tools, but you're not super used to using them. So you're a little bit slower than you are in answering the questions and you were on practice exam 1. So you just answer fewer questions than you did. And that can really lead to a score plateau at that stage in the study, right? It's like, okay, I'm more accurate, but I'm answering fewer of the questions. And the end result is that I'm kind of getting the same score as I was getting in my early practice exams. And eventually the converse of that is going to be true, right? Once you start trying to speed up, maybe you start ditching some of those tools that helped improve your accuracy. But in doing so, your accuracy goes down. So you're answering more questions, but that hard won accuracy goes down. So you can see these kind of two countervailing goals that we have, accuracy and speed. You can improve accuracy, but sometimes that affects speed. You can improve speed, but sometimes that affects accuracy. So that leads to score plateaus for a lot of test takers. Because you improve one, it affects the other, your score, the end result kind of stays the same. So what we're going to talk about today is how to execute a really solid study plan. And Emma, a recording of this will be emailed to you. So if you have to bail, sorry to see you go, but you got to go to class, you'll have a recording emailed to you. So we got to execute a study plan that allow us to get accuracy, that'll help us get our target score, and eventually enable us to answer more of the questions while maintaining that accuracy. There's no other way to do it. You can't focus on speed too early or else accuracy will plummet. You gotta deal with accuracy first, which might involve slowing down a little bit, and then we'll address speed. And that's the study plan that we'll have to execute to do this. What we're going to talk about today is when we'll make that big score increase. When we put those two things together, we will experience a substantial score increase. We're going to do that by really forefronting the accuracy, focusing on tips to help us get more accurate, and making sure we're not being impeded in our goal to become more accurate, and then eventually turn our attention to speed so we can answer more questions with that newfound accuracy. We'll have to be patient though. This can take some time, and we might experience a few score plateaus, but if we keep with the study plan and the tips we'll be talking about in the 2 stages of the study plan, we will eventually make that big score increase and scale that amount if we're going to continue this metaphor. And when I say be patient, like we will be patient. Many test takers who I've personally tutored or taught in a classroom do not experience the score increase until a week or 2 before the exam. Got to plug away, plug away, and plug away. And finally, in that week or 2 before the test, sometimes the week of the test, they make that big score increase and they're able to execute that on the real test too. We've got to follow the tips, got to follow this process. But to help ensure that this jump does occur for y'all, we're going to talk about some tips for both stages of that study plan. First stage, accuracy. We'll go over 4 different tips we can use for that stage. And then we're going to talk about what we can do in the timing stage, 3 different tips we can do to make sure we make that big score increase during that stage as well, so our score doesn't permanently plateau. Okay, let's talk about some helpful habits during the accuracy stage of the studies. By the way, how many of you feel like you're in this stage of your studies right now, where you're focused on accuracy, not on timing? Imagine it's most of us. We'll talk about what we should do in this accuracy stage of the studies, and hopefully when we can move out of the accuracy stage of the study. At what point we can actually stop focusing on accuracy and begin focusing on timing. So a lot of us are in that right now. I'm happy to hear that. Here are some tips we can all execute to help this stage go smoothly and help us get that score increase. Number one tip I have for y'all, maintain a question journal. For all 3 sections of the exam, you should maintain a journal that keeps track of the questions you miss, which concepts or skills it tested, whether it was during timed or untimed practice, and a brief description should be included of why you missed that question, and any solutions you can think of to help you avoid that mistake in the future. How many of us are maintaining a question journal right now that includes all of these things, all of them? What question we missed, what concepts it tested, whether it was timed or untimed, why we missed it, and solutions. All right, happy to see. Ramon, that's awesome you're doing that already. Sounds like some of us aren't doing all of the details. Some of us are starting it right now. Really, really excited to hear that, Savannah and Allison. This is crucial. Because what's the goal in this stage is accuracy. How do we get more accurate on the LSAT? We take the questions we're missing, and we change it so we stop missing those questions in the future. The problem is with that is that most people aren't equally good at all parts of the LSAT, where we should dedicate all of our review time equally to all of the various question types in the LSAT, or the 3 types, or we should distribute our study time, our review time equally to the 3 sections of the LSAT. Some of us are better at some sections than others. Some of us are better at some question types than others, some skills than others. Some of us are just better at certain types of really tested skills on the LSAT. So what a question journal can do is help us keep track of the areas of the LSAT that we should prioritize in our review, the areas where we can get the most bang for our buck with respect to our review time. We have a finite amount of review time. We want to dedicate it to the areas that are going to help us increase that accuracy. We don't need to review the stuff that we're already super accurate on. That's not going to, if we're already getting 100% of the must be true questions correctly, it doesn't make sense to review those. What a question journal should reveal to us is what we can do to review where we should really dedicate our review time to get more accurate. So we're going to include all of those things in our question journal. I have an example question journal included here. I like to use a spreadsheet because I don't know, I'm a certain type of nerd that likes spreadsheets. And you can do a lot of things on the spreadsheet too. You can make drop-down menus to keep the types of questions that you are getting wrong, enter it easily. You can include the skills involved, like diagramming sufficient and necessary conditions, or common LSAT flaws, or causation. You can color code it based on a variety of things. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with a sample journal to make really reviewing that sample journal, or that question journal, excuse me, easy. It's important that we review that at least once a week. Oops. We really want to review that at least once a week to get untimed practice. We'll talk about that more in just a second. All right. Mary has a really great comment here. I hope you don't mind me bringing it up, Mary. Mary brings up that is using a question journal that's not working because every question has its challenges. What I would encourage you to do, Mary, is to start to try to diagnose as best as you can any commonalities between the questions that you are missing. And I'm going to push back a little bit against your statement that every question has its challenges. Every question has its challenges, but usually they are not unique challenges. They're challenges that the LSAT tests over and over again. So try to figure out, after reviewing a question journal, what are the challenges being presented in the questions that you're missing? And that can really be documented in the why I missed it part of the test or of the question journal. Why did I miss it? Was it challenging language? Was there a certain skill involved in answering this, like a common fallacy or diagramming? Or was it like, were they supposed to make scenarios or different worlds in doing this game? Or was this a certain type of passage? This is a passage where the author was really advocating the argument, or really where the author is more descriptive and describing other people's arguments. Really try to diagnose those similarities, because that'll really get to the heart of what you can work on to improve. So yes, every question has its new challenges, but typically they're challenges that recur across multiple questions, and diagnosing that can really direct your attention to where you can get the most out of your review. Another helpful habit that we can get into, we can build during the accuracy stage of our studies, is asking ourselves constantly, am I sure I know what I'm doing? What do I mean by that? A lot of people learn how to do LSAT questions. They watch a video or attend a class or work with a one-on-one tutor. It gives them the strategies to implement when they're doing a particular LSAT question, or when they're approaching a logic game or reading comprehension passage. Then when it comes time to do that particular question or game or passage, you kind of just go back to what you did on practice exam 1. You just start freestyling. Instead of actually implementing those strategic approaches you spent time to learn, you just start kind of picking answer choices that make the most sense to you, answer choices that seem right. Rather than using sound and proven skills in order to approach that question and pick the answer choice that doesn't just make sense or seem right, but rather is verified as the right answer based on that approach, you just kind of go with your intuition. And this is a problem that affects a lot of test takers. And I noticed there's someone in the chat section who says, I have this problem. That is absolutely awesome that you are able to self-diagnose this problem. That is like a level of self-awareness that I'm not sure I possess. So, hats off to you to doing that. And it sounds like this might be happening in the time section for some of us, in the time section of our studies. Remember, this stage, accuracy stage, we're not concerned about time yet. We're just concerned about building our accuracy. So when we apply the rules, we apply the strategies, yes, we will get slower. Remember, that's okay in this part of the studies. We're just trying to get more accurate. What can be really bad is that, what can be, I shouldn't say really bad, what could slow us down in our progress is if we just kind of pick answer choices that seem right or make sense in the accuracy stage, because this is the stage where we really want to build our comfort with these strategic approaches, where we start to get a little bit more careful with these strategic approaches, where we apply it consistently. And through that careful and consistent application of these approaches, we eventually get a little bit more comfortable with them. As we get a little bit more comfortable, we start to get a little bit more faster. So if we're just kind of relying on our intuition, all we're doing is reinforcing the same skill set that we brought to the table in our first practice exam. We're not building our comfort with a new approach that's going to enable us to not only answer a higher percentage of the questions correctly, but also eventually enable us to answer more of the questions correctly. So yeah, Nilu, it's totally normal to slow down when you're applying new techniques. It's important in this stage, this accuracy stage of the studies, that we are applying these new techniques. So some of us, it sounds like, okay, I know that I'm kind of relying on intuition a little bit too much in my studies right now. If you're not sure, there's a couple of questions you can ask yourself. Question number 1, are you attempting to anticipate the correct answers in logical reasoning? Nearly every single logical reasoning question is anticipatable. You can predict to a certain extent what the right answer is going to say. Now, the questions do tend to vary in how anticipatable they truly are. Some questions across the board, you can predict what the right answer is going to say pretty closely. Other questions, you just have a more general sense of, okay, this is what the right answer could do. This is what the right answer is likely to be about. So you have more of a shape of a prediction rather than a precise prediction. But for basically every logical reasoning question, you can get pretty close to what the right answer should say. So if you're not using strategies that help you anticipate what the correct answer will say consistently in logical reasoning, you may not be building skills that are going to eventually help you become good. I'll just give you an example of how this manifests in studies. How many times when you're studying logical reasoning questions do you get down to two answer choices? You got the right answer in there, but there's another answer choice that you kind of like too, and you're not sure which of those two is truly correct. Does that happen to you? Like a lot? Yeah. One of the most common issues test takers experience. In my decade of working with the LSAT, if I had $1 for every time a student brought that as a concern to me, like I don't want to exaggerate. I wouldn't be rich, but like I would be able to like put a down payment on like a Nissan Versa or something. Like I've heard this a lot. So it sounds like a lot of us are experiencing this too. Anticipating the correct answer will dramatically reduce the number of times that happens to you. And when you reduce the number of times that happens to you, where you're waffling between two answer choices, your accuracy is going to go up significantly. So it's really important that we are attempting to anticipate the correct answers on our log. It's really, really going to be helpful. But if we're not anticipating what the correct answers are, we're likely just kind of doing what we did in practice exam 1. We're just like, okay, I've read that passage, I've read that stimulus, now I go into the answer choices, and now I'm just kind of gonna be thrown by the answer choices. I'm just going to kind of let the answer choices work me to a certain extent, where I kind of get attracted to tempting but incorrect answer choices, or I kind of push away the correct answer choice because I don't know what I'm looking for, because I didn't anticipate the correct answer. So it's really important to ask ourselves, am I attempting to anticipate the correct answers in logical reasoning? Because that's a way to check if we're just relying on our intuition, or if we're starting to build a sound strategic approach that's going to really increase our accuracy. Another question we can ask ourselves is, am I making deductions, scenarios, or they're sometimes called worlds, before the questions in logic games? Sometimes test takers call certain games like a grind it out game or a plug and chug kind of game. The implication is that there are a lot of games on the LSAT where you can't really make deductions, where making scenarios or worlds isn't helpful. So what you have to do is just go to the questions and try out a bunch of stuff, kind of work through each question in the process of trial and error. People who say that there are a lot of games like that on the LSAT didn't build this skill in the accuracy part of their studies. They didn't realize that there are so many different ways to make scenarios or worlds in a game that prevent you from having to do that basically gift you the right answers before you even get to that first question. So if you're not making these deductions or making these scenarios or making these worlds in logic games, not only are you going to not become as accurate as you otherwise could be, because when you are really just trying out every single answer choice in the game, you are prone to make mistakes, and you eventually might need to, and you might not get questions that you could otherwise get correct. But you also are going to be a lot slower than you otherwise would be. You're going to do more work in the questions than you need to. Because you could have just front-loaded all that work before you got to the questions and saved a bunch of time in the process. We get a lot of questions from students as well about how do I know that I made all the right deductions in the game? How did I know that I connected all the rules in the right way and kind of know how that game works? Question you can ask yourself when you're doing a game to see if you've kind of made all the right deductions. Just ask yourself, how often do I have the answer to these absolute questions? Questions that ask me which of the following must be true or must be false. Well, you should have the answers to these most of the time. Making the deductions, making the scenarios, making the worlds gives you the answers to these absolute must be true or must be false questions. So if you don't have the answers to these, it's typically the case is that you didn't do enough to make those deductions or scenarios that would help you answer that. So if you aren't answering these questions consistently, that's a good sign that you're not actually making the deduction scenarios and worlds that are going to increase your accuracy and also enable you to eventually go faster. For reading comprehension, ask yourself, are you noting the argument and structure in reading comprehension? The way you can kind of, a way you can kind of note if you are answering the right, if you are really noting the argument and structure for reading comprehension correctly is to ask yourself, okay, is my performance on reading comp mostly tied to my interest or familiarity with the subject of the passage? If that's the case, you're probably not approaching reading comprehension in the best way. You might not be building the skills to help with your accuracy. Because most of the questions, this might be surprising, most of the questions for reading comprehension have very little to do with the subject of the passage. Rather, they're all about the viewpoints expressed in the passage and how those viewpoints are supported and how that support gets expressed in the structure of the passage. So it's really important that we ask ourselves that. Because if our ability for reading comprehension is tied to the topic, like we only feel comfortable with the arts and humanities passages and don't feel so comfortable with the science passages, it might be the case that we don't know what we're doing. Okay, so helpful habit number 3 for this accuracy stage is going to be to just simply put a pause on our timing concerns. It's really important that we do that. Now, when we put a pause on our timing concerns, we really need to force ourselves to not worry about how long it's going to take us to answer a question. What we need to focus on is doing it correctly. This kind of just goes into what we were just talking about, right? We need to put the pause on the timing concerns so that we feel empowered as students to approach the question with those sound strategic approaches that we were just talking about. So don't worry about our timing concerns in the accuracy stage. Focus on doing it correctly. But there's a very important caveat to this. Working slowly and carefully does not mean building bad habits. There are certain things that even when we're working slowly, we can't allow ourselves to do because they're just not going to be strategies that we can implement on the real test and still get that score that we want. For instance, on logic games, we can't check every single answer choice. We just don't have the time to do that. That's why we want to kind of front load the work and make these deductions or make these scenarios, aka worlds, before we get into that first question. So yes, if we're taking a long time on a game, that's okay. But if we're taking a long time on a game because we're checking like every single answer choice with a new setup, or we're just plugging in information from the answer choice to see if it works or doesn't work, that's not as okay. Because that's not going to be an effective solution for us on the real test. For reading comprehension, we can take our time reading the passage, or we should take our time reading the passage so that we have a really solid understanding of it. But on the questions themselves, we're not going to have a ton of time to look back at the passage. Even with the benefits of Control or Command F, which we do have on the at-home version of the LSAT that's going to be in place for the next couple of years, we still don't have enough time to look back at the passage consistently. Really, we should limit the amount of time we look back at the passage to a few times, 1, 2, or 3 times per passage. So if when you're practicing reading comprehension, even in this accuracy stage, if you're rereading large parts of the passage for every single answer choice you look at, that's not going to be so okay. Because that's a bad habit that's not going to help us speed up later on. So it's important that we put a pause on our cognitive concerns. Don't worry about how long it takes to answer the questions, focus on doing it correctly. But doing it correctly does not mean allowing ourselves to build bad habits that will impede our ability to speed up later. So what are we allowed to slow down on? Well, for logic games, it's okay if we're slow when we're building our setups or representing the rules or making those deductions or scenarios. That's all okay. For reading comprehension, it's okay if it takes us a long time to read the passage and annotate the passage and mark up and highlight the important parts of the passage, or anticipate what the main point is going to be, or what the author's attitude or tone is. All of those things are okay. It's less okay to check all our answer choices in logic games with the diagrams, or look back at the passage constantly, especially rereading large parts of the passage. That's going to be less okay. So we're going to put a pause on timing concerns. We're going to do it right, except when those timing concerns except for when those pause on timing concerns leads to us building bad habits. All right, final tip for the helpful habits in the accuracy stage of our studies. Do not move on to timing until we are sufficiently accurate. And in my experience, this is one of the most important turning points in students' test-taking process. It's supposed to be a star, but it's just dramatic. It's symmetrical. Anyway, that's an asterisk. This emphasizes importance. Let me try it again. That's even less pretty. Anyway, this is really important. This is an important turning point. In my experience, so many test takers go to timing too early. They do not, have hashtag, has asterisk. It's like an unholy combination of the two of them. You get the point, though. Hopefully, this is important. That's what that's supposed to emphasize. Okay, we can't move on to timing until we are sufficiently accurate. And if we move on to timing before we're sufficiently accurate, our scores can really plateau for a long time. We don't want that. So we want to focus on accuracy and doing all these helpful habits in the accuracy stage of our studies until we are sufficiently accurate. And what does that mean to be sufficiently accurate? Well, it means our accuracy on questions that we do untimed needs to be exceeding the accuracy our target score will eventually require. Just think about it. If we're not as accurate as we need to be untimed, it's going to be really, really difficult to all of a sudden get more accurate when we have the clock pressuring us to move more quickly on the actual test. So before we move on to that timing stage, we need to focus on our accuracy. We need to make sure our accuracy gets to the point that our target score required. This, by the way, is why it's so important to have a target score in the first place. Not only is it a goal that you can motivate yourself towards achieving, but it also helps you make the determination of when can I move on from this accuracy and understanding stage to my actual timing stage. So I've included in here some kind of common target scores and the accuracies they would require. So 175 is going to require you to be about 95% accurate, 172 about 92% accurate, 170, 90, 165, 82, 163, 80, 160, 75%, 58, 70%, 55, 65%, and 153, 62%. Whoops, that wasn't none of that. All right, so these are some common accuracies that we'll need to achieve before moving on to time. And I sometimes get questions about like, okay, does this mean I need to be this accurate on all three of the sections? Or is it okay, like if I'm kind of like aiming for a 170, that requires me to be 90% accurate. Is it okay if I'm like 100% accurate on logic games and 90% accurate on logical reasoning and 80% accurate on reading comprehension? Because all of those together is like an average of 90% accurate. And yeah, this can be okay, but I really would try to endeavor to get this accurate on all three sections. And the reason why is because you don't know which part of your LSAT is going to be the hardest part compared to the other parts. And you don't know which part of your LSAT is going to be the easiest part compared to the other parts. So if you're like on average, this type of student who aces logic games, gets like 90% on logical reasoning, gets about 80% on reading comprehension. Yes, your overall accuracy is about 90%. But let's say you had a really, really hard reading comprehension section on your exam. You know, really hard reading comprehension section on your exam, that 80% might turn into like a 70 or 75%. So if these stay the same, we're getting 100% on the easier logic game section and 90% on the average logical reasoning section. You get a really hard reading comp section. So that turns into like a 70%. Well, you might not get that 170, even if your accuracy was a 90% overall. So given time, I would endeavor to get about this accurate on all three of the sections. Although it's okay if you eventually just need to make the determination, like overall, I'm 90% accurate, I want that 170. Yes, I'm a little bit worse in one of the three sections, but I gotta get to timing at some point. This is where I make the determination. So it's okay if you're not that for all three of the sections, but you should spend as much time as you can trying to get there. All right. So let's say we've reached that accuracy. Hurrah, we throw ourselves a little party, and then we get to work on the timing stage of our studies. What are some helpful habits we can implement then? Well, this is really important. We want to ease ourselves into time practice. A source of score plateaus and a source of discouragement for a lot of test takers is, yeah, maybe they do really well in that understanding and accuracy stage, so getting the accuracy that timing their target score requires. They jump right back into practice exams, and all of a sudden their accuracy just torpedoes. That can happen to a lot of test takers because the dramatic shift from going from untimed practice to the really tight timing constraints we have on full-time tests is just too dramatic. It's too severe. It's too constraining. And that just torpedoes your part accuracy because you're moving too quickly and all of a sudden you're not engaging in all of those helpful strategies that helped you get that accuracy in the first place. So what I would recommend is easing ourselves into the timing stage of our studies. So an exercise we can do, rather than jumping into full practice tests or even full sections of practice tests, is to just start with 20 minutes to complete 10 easy to medium difficulty level logical reasoning questions. If you're using practice tests to prep, you can use the first 10 questions of an LR section because these tend to be of easy to medium difficulty level. So give yourselves 20 minutes to complete those. That's more time than you should use on the actual test. But remember, we're easing ourselves into that time constraints of the real practice test. So we give ourselves 20 minutes for those 10 easy to medium difficulty level questions. We can also give ourselves 24 minutes for 2 easy to medium difficulty level logic games. And also 24 minutes for 2 easy to medium difficulty level RC passages. So these are the timing constraints that we're going to start with. This tends to work for most test takers. You may need to give yourself a little bit more, maybe a little bit less than this, depending on your own time needs, but this tends to work for most people. So we start with this. And again, if you're using practice tests for the easy to medium level, easy to medium games or easy to medium passages, you can just use the first two of most sections. So we start with 20 minutes for 10 questions or 24 minutes for 2 passages or games. And we can see if we can maintain our accuracy with these time constraints. So if we're going again with that 90% accuracy, we should be getting 90% of the questions, and 9 out of 10 questions, maybe all but 1 or sometimes 2 questions for the games or passages, and see if we can maintain that accuracy with these timing goals. If we can, we're just going to slowly and incrementally drop the amount of time that we give ourselves. So maybe instead of 20 minutes for those 10 questions, we start to give ourselves 18 minutes. Maybe instead of 24 minutes for the 2 passages or games, we give ourselves 22 minutes. And we just slowly and incrementally work our way towards test speed. If your accuracy ever drops when doing this, that may be a sign that you're starting to go too quickly. You just need a little bit more experience with more time for these 10 questions, 2 passages, or 2 games. And by doing this, we should work ourselves towards trying to finish this within about 15 minutes for each of those. So that's a way we can work our way towards test speed. How many times should we get 100% accuracy in certain time frame before shortening time? Well, you don't necessarily need 100% accuracy unless your goal is to get like a 180. So if your goal is a 180, then 100% would be what you want to obtain in your accuracy before reducing the time. I would say 1 or probably better 2 times before you can reduce the time. I think it's okay to go after just 1 time because it's like, okay, I did it within that time. Let's see if I can push myself to move a little faster. The point is to put a little time and pressure on you. And so if you do it once, get that accuracy that your target score requires. It's okay to move on. Try it again with a little bit less time. Then that second attempt, then you check your accuracy. Oh, if my accuracy goes down a little bit less time, then it's a good idea to go back to a little bit more time and see if you can get the accuracy of 100% or whatever it is for your target score the second time before reducing the time again. Does that make sense? So we'll push ourselves to move the time down a little bit faster. We need to be comfortable going back and getting more practice with more time if our accuracy goes down once we shorten the time. All right, second helpful tip we can do. Once we actually start moving on to practice tests, we want to practice a strategic approach for each section on our practice tests. Let's kind of think of this as like the finishing touches. What are some strategic approaches we can do for practice tests to help us dedicate the very limited amount of time that we have smartly, intelligently, strategically? So what can we do? One thing we do is implement time goals for each of the 3 sections. Remember, the earlier questions in each of the 3 sections tend to, in aggregate, be a little bit easier than the later questions. So we present time goals for each of the 3 sections to make sure that we're dedicating less time to the earlier, easier questions and preserving more time for the later, more difficult questions. This, by the way, is why I recommend for that first tip, really only using easy to medium questions when you're pushing yourselves to go faster, because those are actually the questions that you should be speeding up on. We should be preserving more time to help us maintain our accuracy on the more difficult questions. We can put in some time goals to make sure that we're not running out of time for the last passages, games, or LR questions, maybe pushing ourselves to move a little bit faster in the first half of the section and preserving more time for the second half of the section. What we can also do is consider skipping questions. I know it doesn't feel good to give up on a question, but really with the very limited amount of time we have on the LSAT, this is a wise investment of your time. And the LSAT really rewards test takers who skip smart, who skip strategically. But a lot of times they put the hardest questions not at the very end of the section, but towards the end of the section. Question 18 or 19 or 20 tend to be some of the most difficult on the exam. And sometimes questions 25, 26, 27 are a little bit easier. So The test really rewards the people who skip those really hard questions in like the 18 to 21 range, so they can have time to answer the easier questions in like the 24, 25, 26, 27 range. So skipping is actually intelligent. It's not a sign of giving up, it's a sign of being smart. The questions you want to skip are obviously really time-consuming questions, really long questions. Those aren't always the same thing, right? Time-consuming and long, not necessarily the same thing. Sometimes the shorter questions are more time-consuming. Sometimes the long, like parallel reasoning questions, you can actually answer really quickly if you have the right strategic approach. Or questions that you know are especially difficult for you. It's a good idea to have certain points where you force yourself to move on from questions too. You know, some test takers, if they've read a stimulus and they didn't get it, they've read a stimulus the second time they still didn't get it, they move on. Because it's not clicking with that question. Some test takers, if they can eliminate only 2 of the 5 answer choices, at that point they just kind of guess and move on. So having those kinds of fail safes in place for you that force you to skip when something's not clicking is a good strategic approach for the LSAT. Also, another thing you do is just try doing the section out of order. Sometimes it really just makes sense to do the hardest stuff first, or to do a certain type of game or passage first, or to do the game with the most questions first, or the passage with the most questions first. Oh, and thank you for bringing this up, Dahlia. Skipping questions, when I say skipping questions, what I really mean, I should have clarified this, so thank you for bringing this up. Skipping and guessing. Remember, there's no guessing penalty on the LSAT. You might as well put an answer choice down because you have, at worst, a 20% chance of getting it correct. So when you skip a question, you can guess it. You always should guess on it. Just put an answer choice down. Also a good idea to flag that answer choice. There's a little icon, little flag you can kind of click on for the LSAT, digital LSAT. And in the kind of list of the questions at the bottom of your screen, there'll be a little flag icon next to that question. So if you have time at the end, you know that those flagged questions are the ones you should go back to. All right, so strategic approach is another thing we can kind of implement to help with the timing so we can kind of be wise with how we allocate our time on this section. Next and final tip I have for the timing stage, if you still can't finish this section or do as much of the section that's going to enable you to get the score you want, consider which steps of solving the questions you can eliminate. Now, sometimes we might want to consider setting a hard cap on the number of scenarios or worlds we make in logic games. And so we'll set that at 3 or 4, some even set it at 2. It's really finding that number that works for you. Sometimes that's writing out fewer notes for reading comprehension. Sometimes for logical reasoning, it's diagramming less often, using the scratch paper for fewer questions. Sometimes it's also just like confidence game. Like, okay, I know I can get to 100% confidence on certain reading comprehension questions or logic game questions or logical reasoning questions, but I need to get more comfortable being only 90% confident or 95% confident, because getting from 90 to 100% confident takes a lot of time, and sometimes that time is not always worth it. You want to remember that this elimination of strategies is an absolute last resort. Far too many people start eliminating stuff, or they just never even do the helpful stuff in the first place because they're worried about time. This should really be the last part of the process. Okay, what can I eliminate from my process if timing is still the issue? These are the last resorts. So those are some helpful tips for the 2 parts of study for the LSAT, accuracy and timing. Hopefully you can implement them to help you avoid, or at least not spend too much time with score plateaus. And as many of you mentioned at the beginning of the session, there are other sources of score plateaus. So I want to briefly go over some of those before talking about LSATMax a little bit more generally. One all too common source of a score plateau is just test anxiety. It's like, yes, I'm doing it at home, on times, not knowing it's the real test, I can do fine, but then I get on the real test and I experience real and legitimate test anxiety. A lot of people do that. And there are a number of things that can help with this source of a score plateau. Do a little shameless plug to our podcast. It's called The Legal Level. And then we did an episode on test anxiety and how to stop study stress with a person who is called a mindfulness facilitator. The person helps you facilitate a sound and productive and healthy mind. And she gives all kinds of tips about how you can tackle and reduce test anxiety. So I really encourage y'all to give that a listen. Two of our instructors, Brandon Frankel and Yelena War, both talked to this UCLA certified mindfulness facilitator, Heather Preet, and have a ton of helpful things you can implement to help reduce test anxiety. You also develop a meditation practice. This really helps with keeping your mind calm and anxiety free, or at least anxiety reduced on the test. There's a bunch of apps you can use for that, Calm, Headspace, that kind of thing. Also, engaging in self-care. When you're not studying for the LSAT, treating yourself with little rewards along the way. Like, it's like, I studied 5 days in a row, I'm gonna give myself a little reward. Making sure that you're getting sleep. The more and more we look into the science of sleep, the more and more it becomes apparent that sleep is very important. So making sure you're getting those 8 hours of sleep a night, eating healthy food, dumping toxic people that are a source of negativity in your life. Sometimes for some of us, that toxic person can actually be ourselves. So learning how to eliminate negative self-talk can be another important thing to help with test anxiety. Exercise has a scientifically proven benefit on mental health. Making sure that we're engaging in our hobbies that keep us happy. All of those things can help reduce test anxiety. Finding and starting an online study group is another thing to help you kind of find joy in the study process, which can also help with test anxiety. While you're talking right now, you've been talking to each other by using that panelists and attendees functions today. So finding a study, starting an online study group, which digital tools like Discord make very, very easy to do. Another thing, journaling, writing down your feelings can help you have test anxiety. A bunch of things you can do to help with that test anxiety. Last thing, changing social media usage can be another one. Sometimes social media can have a negative impact on how we think about ourselves. It doesn't always feel good if we're on the LSAT Reddit or looking at LSAT TikTok or LSAT Instagram. We're seeing a bunch of people scoring better, not mired in a scoring plateau. That makes us feel bad about ourselves. That can only make us more anxious about the test. So changing how often we use social media can be another source of reducing test anxiety. Another common source of score plateaus, definitely many of you brought it up, was study time and motivation. So I'm really glad to that helped you, Savannah, changing that social media usage. So for study time, what we're looking at is doing 2 to 4 hours of study time a day, 5 to 6 times a week. It's a lot, but you can do it while working full time or taking the full load of classes. We just need to make sure that we are actually implementing time to do that. So how can we do that effectively? Well, there's a number of things we can do to make sure we're getting that study time. Making a study calendar, following is an important one. Scheduling time in that calendar of our choice, honoring those commitments, those are all things to keep us on track. If we're ever finding ourselves not so motivated to start our studies in a given day, grab an area that excites you. It's like, you know what? I've been killing on logic games. I enjoy logic games. I don't feel super hyped to do LSAT right now. You know what? I'm going to start my studies off with just a couple logic games to get the ball rolling. That can really help you stay motivated and actually follow your study calendar. Rewarding yourself for sticking to a study schedule is really, really helpful. A lot of times score plateaus can be so difficult because you're not getting the carrot of studying for the LSAT, which is your score increasing. So finding that, okay, I need to find other areas to reward myself if my score isn't going up. So start rewarding yourself for things that you know are leading indicators of your score going up. Things like sticking to a study schedule or your accuracy going up, and rewarding yourself for that really help with that motivation. The thing, using apps that limit your social media time. There are apps that literally like cut you off from Instagram or TikTok or whatever after a certain amount of time. Using those apps while you're studying for an LSAT can make it so that you are not wasting too much time. So you can have those 2 to 4 hours of study time a day. Another shout out to our podcast. We talked about this in a recent episode. It's called The Psychology of Sticking to an LSAT Study Schedule. Encourage you to listen to that to get a deeper dive on what you can do to keep yourself psychologically motivated to stick with that study schedule. All right. So that's going to be it. Got to talk about our course right now. All right, so just going to do this. So the #1 ranked online LSAT course here at LSATMax. And I think a really benefit of the LSATMax course is just how flexible it truly is. It can be used for both parts of the study process really effectively. We have the full course that can really help instill that understanding during the accuracy stage. Full course, sound strategies, flashcards, homework, all of which is going to help you understand things better. Need any more? We have office hours every day. Sounds like a couple of you are hopping in on one right now that are led by instructors who are going to do deep dives into individual parts of the LSAT. These are 99th percentile instructors, people who scored really high on the LSAT, but didn't start from a really high score. People who are not naturals, people who had to learn the test. They can help guide you using their own personal experiences across your joint study plan. And additionally, we can help you in the timing stage because you have all 90 prep tests, which you can take as a full test or as a flex exam. You take more than once. If you want to do some review of those exams, try it a second time as part of your study process. All 90 prep tests to help you work on timing. Another thing you can purchase with us is one-on-one tutoring. If you need a little bit more help on either side of this study process, that accuracy side or the timing side, we have tutors who can help you with one-on-one tutoring. So you can check out the prices and packages available on our tests. And I'm gonna just, while I answer some questions, I'm gonna put this on the board so that we can see what some students said while I answer some questions. Okay, I noticed that there's a question from Nadine right now. She's a new test taker. Welcome, Nadine. How much time do we get in between each section? On the real test, it's about a minute. So when you take the test online, they're taking the LSAT-flex in June or the new at-home 4-section LSAT in August or later. You'll have about a minute between each section. Although you can choose to opt out of that minute and start that section as soon as you're ready. So got a couple questions. What was the last line item? Are you noting the argument? Put that up for you, AJ, if you're still here. Are you noting the argument and structure in RC? You're actually writing out what those things are, because those things are really important to increasing your accuracy and reading comprehension. Let's see if there are any other questions that I missed along the way before we go. Let's see. If you want to ask a question, you of course can. Cool. Looks like all the questions have been answered. Another question, Andrew asks, how many times should I score accurately on an untimed section before moving on? So how many times should you, so if we're talking about like this tip right here, easing it into the time practice, how many times should you score accurately before reducing the time? I would say once or twice. Of course, if you reduce the time and all of a sudden you stop scoring accurately at that reduced time, you should go back and give yourself a little bit more time, get a little bit more time practicing with that additional time. All right, looks like all the questions have been answered. Hope you all have found this helpful. Hopefully you have some tips. Hopefully we can get unstuck from our own score plateaus. Remember, it's very natural, but there are things we can do that we talked about today to help us move past that score plateau. I hope you're able to effectuate these tips, and I hope you're able to take them on your journey towards a higher score. So thank you for hanging out with us today. It was nice to talk to you all. I wish you the best study process. And hopefully see you soon at one of our office hours or one of our future webinars. So thanks. Enjoy the rest of your day. Happy studying.